to you all, and particular welcome to our two special guests tonight, Professor Lucy Newlyn, Emeritus Fellow here at St Edmund Hall and formerly Professor of English here at the University, and Dr. Regent, who is a lecturer in English at the English faculty here in Oxford, and based at Regent Park College, and also a qualified medical doctor and psychiatrist currently working at the University Counselling Service. Richard, how you combine those two? It's a puzzle, but you're amazing, both of you. Thank you. Let me just sort of introduce tonight by saying that really, in a sense, what has prompted this conversation is Lucy's book, which some of you will have read, and others of you would have an opportunity to read because they're on sale there at the back. Diary of a Bipolar Explorer. And I've been reading it over the past few weeks and wanted to say thank you to Lucy for a number of things really that emerged for me. First of all, Lucy, thank you for helping us to understand the nature of bipolar as an illness. I had always assumed that bipolar was a swing between being periods of manic activity and then periods of depression, and then it was kind of moving from one to the other. Lucy's helped me to understand that actually often both of those things can be happening at the same time, which I didn't know, but a quote, the pattern of my illness involves episodes of mixed moods at both extremes. So helping, those little insights, fantastically helpful. Secondly, thank you for sharing your insights on how communities and society view mental illness, and I think that's been very helpful for all of us, certainly involved in welfare care, but more widely as well. Those insights have been incredibly helpful. Thirdly, thank you for your incredible courage and honesty about the pain of mental illness, the fear of insanity, and the humiliation of being sectioned. I mean, what courage to write about that and to be so open and vulnerable about it. Fourthly, thank you for the creative and poetic reflections on what you've been going through and how you've been processing it, and how writing poetry, for example, has helped you to make sense of what's happening and to give you an outlet to express how you're feeling. And lastly, thank you for your social conscience over other people's sufferings, especially those who are victims of injustice, social exclusion, or homelessness, for example. Thank you for all of that. Now, those were just 5 things that I really appreciated from the book, and if that helps you to want to go and buy a copy, please do. Right, well, without more ado, Richard, I think you're going to kick off with some questions that you've got for Lucy.
Thanks very much, Will. I mean, I feel tremendously privileged to be here, Lucy, talking with you about your book. Like Will, I found it tremendously beautiful as a book, often very moving, also very witty, playful at times, and on occasion, I suppose it has periods where you enter quite a nightmarish world that's actually quite frightening and startling. Especially, I think, at the beginning of the book, where you're sort of going into your first sort of major episode of illness. I mean, I was going to start with asking you about why you had decided to write the book at this point in your life. And I think we'd agreed, I might just read a little passage from the book, which I found particularly beautiful, where Lucy is talking about, I suppose, a difference in language, it seems to me, between the language of medical professionals and the language that you might use as someone who has the illness, and particularly as a poet and a writer who has the illness. You say, the iconography puzzles me even more than the reductive labelling. Where are the marblings, the striations? Where does red shade into blue? Where are spring and autumn in the tree's calendar? Is there no place for laughter amid tears? Give a pen to anyone who has this illness and tell them to draw it. The last thing that they will think of is stark duality. Moods are not extremes which take turns. They come in multiple sounds, forms, colours. They mix, they gyrate, they layer, they shift by gradations. Why try to confine them in separate cells? Why not allow them freedom to move, to blend and to explore? There's a whole world between the two poles. We need an open passage, or at least an accessible tunnel. So that seemed to be tied up perhaps with your thinking about writing the book. But would you like to say a little bit more about what had led you to write the book, what you were hoping to do in that?
Yes, well, first of all, just a bit about the evolution of the book, because it arose under special circumstances. The recent retirement. I don't think I could have written this book while I was still in post, partly because of the nature of the job, which is very hectic, partly also because of the presence of stigma. It wasn't something that I felt that I could be open about while I was in post. As soon as I retired, not only did I have more time, but I started to think back on the previous 15 years and to want to see a pattern in them and to understand what had been in some ways quite wretched, but also in other ways exploratory, exciting, because of the nature of the mood disorder. My intention in writing was partly to give a shape to those 15 years. And giving a shape to things is something that I find very helpful in the disorder, in controlling the disorder, getting the measure of it, if you like. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to write it. But I also wanted just to give a very clear, very candid account of what it is like to have this disorder on a day-to-day basis, living with it. And that's why the diary form came into play. And the poetry elements of it are about the heightened states, if you like, and the moments of distillation, whereas the diary element is more about the diurnal living with it. And I also wanted to make a book that was accessible to any reader, because it seems to me that, and this is going back to the bit that Richard read out, it seems to me that everyone who is human goes through moods. This is part of the nature of being human, that one's moods are moving all the time. And I wanted, instead of having bipolar disorder stigmatized as this and misrepresented as this kind of caricature of, you know, the downturned face and then the manic happy face, the duality of that, I wanted to get that sense of the flow between them, and thereby to build a sense of communality with every human being. So those were the main, and destigmatizing the illness was really one of the main projects.
Thank you very much. The book starts with a very, very vivid account of your first major episode of illness with this problem, which was when you were with your father in hospital during his last illness, and keeping vigil with him at his bedside. And I think I was saying to you earlier, this account, which is quite astonishing in the book, it's one of the most compelling accounts I've ever read, I think, of drifting into sort of a psychotic way of thinking. And I know you've done a summary of it, Lucy, is that right? Which
yes.
You might want to just read to us.
Yes. What it is actually is an edited version of what you would find in the book, but that's rather longer and more detailed. And I wanted to produce something that I could read out. Nonetheless, it is quite a long piece, so be patient. But it's very important to establish the nature of the extremes before going into a discussion of the in-between states. So what happened was that I was sitting with my father in a vigil beside his bed. He was dying, and I had lost out on 2 nights of sleep, which becomes a key factor. And as I was watching him, his oxygen mask turned into a gas mask, and he was lying in a trench on the Somme, and all around him were victims of the First World War. So that was the nature of the psychosis, and I'm just going to read what happened from that point onward, from the point where it started to do that drifting. From this point onward, I was disturbed by extremely powerful feelings. I can remember addressing the matron in tones of urgency. If enough help could be found, if these sick people could be saved, perhaps the next war could be averted. She took me into her office. How flat her voice sounded as she ran through a few pat phrases. She lacked warmth. She was too professional. By contrast, I was a prophet who could save the world. I told a few more people about this, loudly. One of the night nurses asked me when I had last slept and looked alarmed when I gave my answer. "Go and sit in that chair and get some sleep immediately," he commanded. I ignored him and found another night nurse with whom I felt a bond which I expressed openly. I felt that this nurse, let's call him David, had elected me as a member of the band of special people. I went up to the receptionist to check with her what I believed to be my baptism had actually taken place. She told me I had made some very disturbing remarks to David. Soon afterwards, Mum came with my sisters Jill and Kate to relieve me from my watch. I had done something wrong on the ward and was under pressure to return to my mum's flat. My crime was not my behaviour on the ward, it was nothing less than patricide. I had been framed by my sisters Jill and Kate. By my sisters Jill and Kate were guilty. They'd gone away and left me on my own in the hospital. I understood that Dad had received an injection to put him to sleep forever. They had wanted this to happen. When I first started shouting, it was to tell everyone that they were not carers. There were only a few of us who truly understood how suffering could be averted. I was their leader. Somehow I was removed from the hospital and into Mum's car. Outside her flat, I hugged her very hard. She was so frightened by the strength of the hug that Kate took a quick decision to pull me forcibly away from her by my hair and sit on me to prevent my moving. She then dialed 999. Mum said to the receptionist on the phone, "We have an hysteric," and gave confirmation that violence was involved, thus instigating the arrival of a police car as well as an ambulance. The siren was harsh, something between a scream and a melancholy wail. The police quickly established that I'd not been violent, so they disappeared from the scene. A kind paramedic coaxed me inside the house, where we talked for a while. He persuaded me to get into the ambulance. I can remember lots of questions, the voice of Kate in front, and a sense of persecution. We arrived at casualty, and Kate talked to a consultant, who explained to her that I must be sectioned. There were 2 guards outside the room where I was incarcerated. She signed the official form with a trembling hand. 2 narratives of my own blur and intermingle from the moment of entering the back of the ambulance. In the first, I was being taken to casualty, which in my hallucinating brain became a special unit. This had been set up to put family members through a series of tests in which their authenticity as carers would be assessed. It was also a unit for the reception and recording of communal memory, to which only members of the very good had access. I was being transferred to the special unit by virtue of my endurance, my empathy. I had just been baptised, and this had given me access to some secret information which needed to be imparted to the world. It was believed by everyone in the special unit that I had special powers of memory, and that when I had imparted my knowledge, not only would many families recover their lost identities, but there would be no more wars. I would be recognised as the healing prophet I truly was. The world would be saved and healed. The second narrative was very different, yet it seemed to be inextricable from the first. In this scenario, I knew for certain by the police car's loud wailing siren that I'd been arrested and was being carried to my trial. Arriving in casualty, I thought I'd been put in prison. I'd turned into a strange thing I couldn't recognise as myself. I sat on a seat which was also a toilet in a large white empty room on my own, where a strong bright light shone on me perpetually. I shouted for a long, long time. When I was let out of the observation room, I saw the A&E area where people were lying on stretchers or trolleys. I was sure they were war victims. There was one whose face was bloated, her whole body was swollen, and it seemed to be in a sack. There were other people whose heads I could see over the tops of screens, and I thought 2 of them were my sisters. I kept hearing their voices, and they wanted me punished. I kept screaming at the top of my voice, "Listen." I was interrogated by many people. In among all my screaming, I can remember going through violent jerking movements with my arms, my head, and my facial muscles. I know for a fact that there were no objects I could hurl around. The room was empty. Yet I'm sure I hurled something. It feels even now as if I did. Then came the patterned curtains and my husband Martin's face between them. He tells me he was with me as I was transferred by ambulance from a cubicle in casualty to the hospital's psychiatric wing, not far from my father's ward. When I arrived there, the 2 narratives of trial and press conference were still going on in my head. Martin was leading me to a television studio where the cameras were ready for the reception of my worldwide message, but outside the ward was a big black bin labelled "domestic waste only." I was a lunatic. I would end up in that bin. Safe inside the safe psychiatric wing, I was still hallucinating. 2 of the staff seemed alternately my friends and my enemies. I liked their faces but couldn't trust them. I thought everything would all come clear immediately and that the trial would end, but it didn't. I was so terrified that I begged forgiveness for my crimes again and again. Some time passed, but that is now trackless. I remember a crowded room where several rows of doctors stared at me, taking their notes. I sensed then that I was facing a panel of judges. I knew myself to be a prophet and believed myself to be present at the final judgment to give my testimony. Someone, I have no recollection of his face or name, summed up the evidence against me. My voice was for justice and everlasting peace, but I was judged unworthy. After that, I can remember only a feeling of monumental letdown and a sense of shame. Sleep at last came.
Thank you very much, Lucy. That, I think, is a tremendously moving account, which has that sort of nightmarish quality, which I was talking about, being suddenly caught up in a world that must have been terrifying and incomprehensible at the very time when your father was so ill in hospital. I mean, when you look back on it, what would you see as being the things that had led up to it in retrospect?
2 years of grieving for my dead sister and the special circumstances in which she died, where I'd been with her in her house up till the very last day and was determined to be with her as she died. But in fact, as it happened, I was downstairs making tea when she did die. And I was determined, therefore, that I would be in the room with my father when he died. And it was that made me so obstinate in sitting out a vigil when I should really have been getting some rest. I would have been better at looking after him if I'd got the sleep. The sleep was what tipped me into the psychotic. The absence of sleep was what tipped me into the psychotic state, and it made me very frightened, that experience, on behalf of students, the students that I was regularly teaching in this college, in this university, because of course the hothouse atmosphere of this university is one which leads to very, very stressful conditions for everybody, tutors and students alike. And there's quite a lot of all-nighters, essays written through the night. There's also quite a lot of clubbing. People can easily go, students can easily go for a couple of nights without sleep. And of course, having had this experience, I knew that there was a danger that they too could go into this. I mean, obviously there was also the additional stress of being beside my dad when he was dying, but you know, it taught me so much about contingency. That's, you know, so much of what happens in these episodes is contingent.
Thank you very much. I certainly would agree with you about sleep. In my experience of people that I've seen developing bipolar, I think that you know, sleep deprivation is often a key factor in the episodes coming on, and particularly the students that I've seen at the counselling service. The all-nighter, I think, is a classic situation, unfortunately, that might bring on, say, a hypomanic episode.
Yes.
I mean, I know there are also other things, perhaps, that we've mentioned when we've talked about it together. One of them, I think, was that you told me you'd sort of stopped drinking, or you'd had a bit of a difficulty with your use of alcohol leading up to that, and then had suddenly stopped.
That's exactly right. Thank you, Richard. That was another key factor in what happened, because for the 2 years after my sister died, I was drinking, you put it kindly, I was drinking very heavily, and I was very, very miserable. But on this particular night, there wasn't any drink in sight, beside in the ward, and I was therefore, one of the contributing factors was that I suffered withdrawal symptoms from the drinking, and they told me that very explicitly afterwards when they were talking to me about looking after myself in the longer term. And as a result of that evening, I then had 10 years in which I touched not a single drop of alcohol.
And we were talking about earlier about the possible link between addiction and bipolar. And it is interesting, I think the statistic is something like about 45% of people with bipolar have at some point some difficulty with addiction to alcohol, and you know, at least I think half of bipolar sufferers have some sort of addiction issue. And I think it does keep cropping up at points, doesn't it? During the book,
I do mention this a lot in my book. In 1979, Dr. Anne Macpherson, dearly beloved and valued GP, told me that she thought I had an addictive personality, and how right she was. You name it. Apart from coke and things like that, I've never done drugs in that sense. But at the moment, I'm addicted to Nicorette, which is because I'm trying not to smoke. Fitness regimes, you wouldn't be able to tell it from looking at me, but there has been a period in my life when I was absolutely addicted to going every day to the gym and to swimming as well. And I think there's a physical explanation for that, isn't it?
Well, certainly when you exercise, you release endorphins,
yes,
which are quite addictive. Yeah.
So that was what was giving me the buzz, the excitement. So I think that addictive tendency, yes, has recurred, and there is a poem in there about that.
And I was also wondering, you know, looking back, because this is the first really big episode of illness that you had, where you received the diagnosis of bipolar. But if going back further, I'm sort of wondering whether perhaps at times you'd self-medicated a bit with,
yes,
you know, with alcohol or other things. Possibly.
Yes, alcohol, but also codeine, Codis, which I took to muffle the sense of extreme emotions, to somehow soften life, make it feel a little less unendurable at times. And there were depressive phases. I was referred to the Warnford quite early on by Anne Macpherson, and I went through depressive phases, had taken medication for these. So this was all part of a pattern, and it wasn't clear, and often diagnosis takes quite a long time, doesn't it?
Yes.
It wasn't clear that there was a bipolar pattern there, and that's partly because, as I say, in the form it takes in my case is mixed. So it's understandable that it wasn't spotted earlier, I think.
Yes. Obviously, the first episode happened when your father was in his last illness, and it's clear, I think, from the book that bereavement is an important element, which keeps cropping up throughout. And reading it the second time, it's surprising how many deaths there are. You know, not necessarily of people who are very, very close to you, but that death is a recurrent theme, I think, in the book. And it seemed to me that very often, you know, the deaths would trigger feelings about other deaths. And then that in turn might interact somewhat with the bipolar at times.
I think that's absolutely right. Death seems to be one of the main triggers. Stress is another, but death the worst one. And it's that sense of going back, replaying in the memory the circumstances of my sister's death, which happens each time somebody dies. And it's like a kind of snowball. The layers build up and build up, so one is carrying more and more of that baggage as one grows older. It's just part of life, isn't it? And I think this must be experienced by everyone, that a bereavement triggers memories of a family bereavement or a friend's bereavement, and it's quite difficult to carry that. So it's not just the bipolar patient who experiences this at all.
Lucy, I also noticed in the book that it was also sometimes world events. So Brexit was a shock to you, election of Donald Trump was a shock to you, but also some personal things like falling over and breaking your ankle and things set off.
That's
so it was
right.
kind of things that disrupted your routine.
That's right. And as I get older, that becomes markedly worse. So, for instance, I now find it very difficult to get on a train and go to London. I wrote a villanelle the other day about getting lost in London. Just very simple things like, the disruption of one's routine can really disturb and can trigger a mood, can trigger a real sense of acute anxiety, which isn't great.
Absolutely, and just that sense of unpredictability, that your world could be suddenly turned upside down, as it was when you had that first terrible bout of illness.
That's
something
right.
like breaking your ankle.
That's right.
Something could do
so
that.
I think there is a sense of. I have been diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of what happened on that night. So there are certain things like an ambulance siren. Crossing the threshold into my mother's flat is also very tricky because it brings back memories of my sister sitting on my body and then calling the ambulance. So there's something about a susceptibility to memory, and these triggers then, activate the mood disorder.
Yes, absolutely, and a great sense, I should think, of vulnerability. That something could happen. I know that there are a number of incidents in the book which again take us back into the world of psychotic experience at times. And I know we may not have time, unfortunately, to read them all out because they're wonderfully clear accounts, I think. Again, quite frightening and nightmarish at times. I wondered if we might just think a little bit about one of them, or just say a little bit about it, possibly, the Torchman.
Yes. The Torchman episode was extremely frightening. It occurred when I went to have a little bit of a break on my own to do some academic writing down in Cornwall, and I rented a cottage in a very, very secluded place, and I had been going through a very paranoid period leading up to that, and Martin was in touch with me as often as possible on a phone. I had to go and talk to him in the village because there was no phone reception in the house. On the first night that I was there, I discovered that because there were windows in the ceiling of the room where I was sleeping, somebody could conceivably look in from outside, and there happened to be a road going around the house where somebody could look in. And this then took me over completely, this fear, because on the first night there was something shining in to my room, and I figured it couldn't be the moon because it wasn't diffuse enough, it wasn't large enough. And gradually, in my paranoid consciousness, what this became was a torchman, a man shining a torch in regularly, night after night. I was there for a month. Night after night, this man was standing on the road above the bedroom, shining this torch into my window. I mean, it was mad, pure madness. And it got madder because what happened was I started to believe that the torchman had been sent by the college to torment me into madness. And I thought that the torch could shine itself into my brain and sort through my thoughts as if it was a laser reading emails. And none of that makes any sense, but that is what I was convinced was happening. So in the end, I called a very nice policeman who came, and eventually, coming back the second time, explained that what had been shining into my window was in fact Jupiter.
I mean, those, for psychiatrists, those things, of course, would be described as persecutory delusions. But it does strike me that it does sort of shade into experiences that many people might be able to relate to do with our sense, perhaps increasingly in our world, that we are under surveillance somehow, that it's a sort of a culture where we are being watched, if you like, more and more, whether via the internet or via security cameras, that sort of thing.
That's right. In this book, in the period leading up to the torchman, I went through a period of being absolutely terrified by security cameras. There's one, you probably know it, as you go up Queen's Lane, there's one perched on the side of the college there, looking down over the graveyard and also up Queen's Lane. And it is a monster of a creature. And I became, really convinced that this thing was following me. But it wasn't the only one, they were all around the place. And then I became convinced, after getting a little bit highly wrought about that, I became convinced that there were secret cameras in my room in college. And not only that, but it was bugged. And not only that, but there was a secret camera on my computer at home, watching me do work for the college at home. And I eventually had to take the computer into the computing services and get them to check it over. And then I came back here, and I was reassured by the people at the lodge, the porters, that it was okay, we could check that none of this was going on because there was a security camera trained on my room, so my room can't have It's so important, the humour as well, isn't it? Because with humour becomes that sense of perspective. So writing something which has a sense of bathos, or has the kind of rational explanation at the end of it all, is very important, because it's what reassures that one is back in the world where there are rational explanations for things.
The humour, I think, is one of the things that I love about your book. It's a very witty and playful book. I'm sure everyone would agree who's read it. Your sense of humour comes through constantly. And it makes a nice connection, actually, with the next thing I was going to ask you about. Another sufferer from bipolar of genius would be Virginia Woolf, who also had a tremendously good sense of humour when writing about her own illness. Woolf often writes about the effects of her bipolar disorder on her own writing process. Not that it was called bipolar in those days. One of the things that she says is, this is one of her letters, "As an experience, madness is terrific, I can assure you, and not to be sniffed at. And in its larva, I still find most of the things I write about," she says. I mean, obviously, Lucy, in your case, you're a very eminent writer, academic, and poet. I mean, how far do you think you found aspects of your own condition helpful, even in your own work?
I wouldn't be a poet if it hadn't been for my sister's death. I started writing for the first time since I was 13 or 14 when my sister died, and the poetry has come out of the illness. I wouldn't be a poet if it weren't for the bipolarity. The highs are exactly as Virginia Woolf describes them. They are a lava. They are. It is volcanic. It's like a kind of a massive eruption of energy. I could write for night after night without stopping, only going to the loo or getting a cups of tea. I could do that, and then Martin gets very frightened when that happens, because of course I'm in danger then of going into a psychotic state, not just a hypomanic state, but a psychotic state. So the lava, that volcanic thing, is there, and it's the bit that I would want to keep if anyone were to say they could find a cure to bipolarity. I'd say, well, can we just keep that bit and forget the depression, because I like it. And recently, when I had my meltdown after retirement and rang up the doctor to say, look, I think I'm in problems here. She said to go through the symptoms, and I said, the real problem here is that I'm enjoying it. I wanted to stay in it, and that's the problem. That you get to the point where it's just absolutely wonderful to be in it, and you don't want to come out, and you lose all insight into the experience, and you depend very heavily then on those around you who know you very well and love you dearly to look after you. And that, I couldn't manage without Martin, who's sitting at the front here. I couldn't manage daily life without that constant alertness and readiness to point out that I should be taking care.
The image of the lava that Woolf uses is quite a rich one, isn't it? Because I suppose it also evokes that sense of danger, doesn't it? That there could be an eruption, so a catastrophic explosion or something.
That's right.
So both a great source of creative energy,
yes,
and yet also something that might turn into something quite disastrous.
That's right.
If it went far
That's
enough.
Right.
I mean, do you think over the years you've got better at sort of picking up where that tipping point might be, as it were?
To be honest, I think I still have great difficulties with it, and I'm sure that Martin would corroborate that. And there's this kind of just this very great friction that that I'm dependent on the highs in order to tap into the bits that I call in this book, when I called it Diary of a Bipolar Explorer, I wanted to get that sense of adventure and exploration that goes with the highs. And the friction is that one just wants to keep that going and doesn't want to come out of it. So I'd say I'm still pretty poor at it, actually.
I mean, I'm sure you will know that Virginia Woolf tended to have terrible crashes en route. Often after she'd done a book, this huge explosion of creative energy, perhaps writing things very quickly, and then suddenly the mood going down. And I think in your book you say something quite similar about your own experience.
That's right. It's not as as they represent it in the kind of classic caricatures. It's not, one extreme and then suddenly absolutely the opposite extreme. There are things in between, but perhaps I could just read a description of what an ordinary day is like if you're depressed. And this is, I go through long periods when that is the state of mind every day, and then the hypomanic periods are very much rarer and very greatly more valued. An ordinary day. It's a mood, the place from which I move only to make weak tea. Its official name is almost as drab as the sofa where it sits me. The sofa's drabness is in it, and the turning grey cushions have only it as their fabric. Boring as boredom, for weeks now it has clung around me like an odour. It has known me for so long, we're more or less identical twins. Inside my pores it got a long time ago, and ordinary stale it is. My body wears it round me like cladding. I am what it wears, and immovably solid. Even if I turn the people to face me going up and down the street, they move only with it. I watch for it to turn me. I can remember it turning. Meanwhile, it sits, and I won't name it.
Very much. One of the lovely things about the book is the poetry, which comes in quite frequently, and I think you say sometimes that you can express things best in poetry. Is that right?
Yes.
I think almost sometimes you say it's more honest. Is that right? Or I think you said poems have interrupted this diurnal pattern at moments of crisis to give their own different kind of testimony.
That's right. In writing the book, I wanted to, as I said earlier, give that sense of the diurnal, of the day-to-dayness of the illness, but then the changes, the shifts from that into the hypomanic or the deeply depressed states. And poetry, because of its musicality, taps deeper than prose into the wordlessness of emotions. You can, through rhyme, through metre, you can access those inaccessible, otherwise, parts, those dimensions of human experience. Now, I'm not saying that prose can't also be musical, and the division between poetry and prose is, of course, a very contested one, and we could have a whole seminar on just that. But in my experience, poetry gives me a much more direct access to emotions, and it comes with crafting. One thing I would say about the larva, the hypomanic state, is that while you're writing in that state, a lot of what you produce is no good. But it gives you access later to how you were feeling, to the feelings. So what happens is that the revisionary process, the subsequent process, the crafting, the making into form, the shaping of the material, is what turns it into something that can be good. Earlier it's just inchoate and a mass of stuff, but it's very important to have it, because that's, you know, where you go to for your raw material.
I did just want to ask you one thing about form of the poetry. You quote at the end Robert Frost talking about poetry being a momentary stay against confusion. But Bernard O'Donoghue, in reviewing the book, I don't think Bernard's been able to make it tonight, unfortunately, but he said something which I thought was very interesting, which is he observed that you often use quite structured Renaissance verse forms like the Sestino and the Villanelle that are quite tightly structured. He wondered if perhaps in some way that was acting as a container for otherwise overwhelming, unmanageable emotions and experiences.
This is something that I did write about a bit in the concluding poem, in the concluding pages of of the book, that in my experience, good writing has got to combine both those deep emotional dimensions and also a sense of critical judgment. If you don't have the judgment, the rational element present in the writing, then it will become less good. In other words, that the whole of your faculties have got to be there in the writing process. And that's why it's got to be the revisionary stage that's important. So the crafting of using fixed forms rather than just free verse is something which enables that discipline to come into play, the giving of shape and the sense of a kind of critical detachment from, as well as the music. It's a paradox in a way, because there's the musicality in the verse, but there's also that sense of discipline of really getting to grips with the form.
Thank you very much. I mean, I could ask you a lot more about literary form, because the texture of this book as a piece of life writing is wonderfully rich and varied. I thought maybe because of the time we might just move on a little bit to experiences of the illness, and I suppose the treatment of the illness, diagnosis and treatment of the illness. And I think I did want to start with that very traumatic experience which you had during the first bout of illness, of being sectioned, as we say in popular parlance, detained under the Mental Health Act. And if I can invoke Bernard's review again, he says that sectioning is a term which has retained an almost superstitious potency. And I wondered if there's anything you wanted to say about that experience, as it seemed to you then, and perhaps as now when you look back on it, whether you've thought any differently about it over the years.
I go over and over the experience. It doesn't become less terrifying as I think back on it. It was the most terrifying experience of my life, I think. And the sense of stigma which came with having been sectioned is something that I think I've been wrestling with for the last 15 years. One of the problems is, of course, that talking about it takes one into family relationships. My conclusion about what happened that night is that it was just a great shame that I was sectioned, because in fact, as it turned out, after I'd had a night's sleep, after I'd slept for quite a long time, then when I got up, I was back again to where I had been before. I won't say that it was a great place to be, because I was, clearly not living a good life after my sister died, but at least I was functioning. And I was able to go and see my father in the ward every day and read him poetry, and it was a very healing kind of time. So normality came back. So my conclusion is that what happened with my mother and sister was an overreaction caused by the terror of insanity. And one of my reasons for writing this book was to try to diminish the terror of insanity. I don't know if you'd be prepared to say anything about sectioning.
Yes, certainly. We'd spoken earlier about this a bit, and Lucy had warned me this might be something that where she might ask me a question. And I have to say, as a psychiatrist, it's something I have a big issue with. I suppose I find emotionally very difficult to sort of be involved in taking away somebody else's liberty, essentially. And I've seen some really horrible incidents over the years of this happening. I do a lot of work in eating disorders. I often have people with anorexia who have a very, very low weight, where they could die very, very easily. And it's very, very difficult there, because often the illness involves you not being able to see at that point how much in danger you are. And that literally you might drop dead on the streets unless you go into hospital. And so I can very, very clearly see that there might be occasions where that might be necessary. I'd say I do think it has big repercussions afterwards, both in terms of trauma for the person, but also for the therapeutic relationship between you and the client. And so it's something which I constantly wrestle with and find very, very difficult and upsetting, actually, often.
Yeah, it is that taking away of liberty which is the worst bit, but also the eye in the door. You know, that was very frightening, feeling that there was somebody who could be watching me through the door all the time. I mean, you know, goes back to the camera and that persecution complex.
Yes. Just thinking about the process of diagnosing the condition and also perhaps monitoring it. One thing you talk about quite a lot in the book is the graph, or graphs, that at the Bipolar Research Clinic, and I think many bipolar clinics will operate this way, you build up a graph of the high and the low moods as two lines, two separate graphs. And I think you found this quite difficult in the way to relate to. I think you say, you know, the graph's already so long, where and what am I in it? You know, it's dehumanizing in a sense and reductive. I don't know if you want to say a bit more about that.
I don't think I'm going to have time to read the questionnaires, unfortunately, because, I mean, that would give you a better sense of what they meant to me. But I'm wholly aware that these questionnaires, which I filled in every week for a long time, were there to help me to understand the mood and to see warning signs of a change of mood coming up. So I'm completely aware that that's what they're for. But they played into my fear of surveillance. It became as though a part of myself was watching myself with that scrutinising, dreadful look of the camera on Queen's Lane. So it was as though I had internalised that world of surveillance, and I really resented having to fill these questionnaires in. And partly what this is about is that there are two questionnaires. One is for the potentially the hypomania symptoms, and the other is for the depressive symptoms. And what you end up feeling, or what I ended up feeling, was that I was being divided into two separate bits, that that no one was kind of taking account of the whole of myself, that I was these two separate sets of symptoms. And indeed it was represented there in a double graph. There I was, visually represented, you know, the mania and the depression there in these two separate lines which were moving across the page. This felt very reductive, and I felt that I wanted the questionnaires to be somehow integrated, or that the multiple choice thing could be replaced with something which was more human, and which, for instance, which asked me to write about the moods using the best words that I could find, or to draw the moods, or something like that, something that was much more human and flexible than these. Nobody likes filling in questionnaires, do they? It does feel very reductive.
And you make lovely use of them in your book and as a literary device. It's often done in a very playful but also very telling way, I think. I remember one patient I had many years ago used to just take the questionnaire and write all kinds of very beautiful things all over it, poems and doodles and that kind of thing, just literally would not be fitted into those boxes. I always enjoyed that tremendously. I did want to ask you about medication, because for this condition...
Close that down, and then just pass the microphone between.
I think it's that one. Is that one?
Is it that one?
Is it the big
Yeah.
one?
Yeah.
So you've had a lot of experience, I'm sure, of different kinds of medication with this condition. And part of that, of course, is a medication called lithium, which has been suggested to you, I think, on a number of occasions, and has been, quite a central plank of the treatment of bipolar. But I think it's one that you've had quite a lot of difficulty in considering.
Yeah. sorry, I just have to, I just want to read the bit about lithium because the quickest way of answering the question of what I feel about this particular medication is just to read it. Lithium, November 2016. 4 chairs in a row like a test, a bright light over the desk, all medical details displayed on the monitor, nothing on the walls, all windows closed, all radiators on, heat overpowering, the psychiatrist's voice monotonous and lulling. You will start the medication, then there will be weekly blood tests to check the toxin levels. Dangers include respiratory depression, seizures, coma. Common side effects include weight gain, tremors in your hands, dry mouth, increased thirst or urination, nausea, vomiting, loss of appetite, stomach pain, changes in your skin or hair, impotence, feeling uneasy. Voice slowing down, radiators humming, nothing on the walls or floors, white light flickering overhead, radiators throbbing, too hot in here, voice continuous, sleep coming, please, sleep coming. Toxicity is lethal. Even a thimble of alcohol can cause renal failure. If you have any unusual symptoms, if you're off balance, check in immediately to A&E. Don't take any chances. No doors or windows in the walls. What do you mean, please, by off balance? A trembling membrane thickens on my brain. Sleep coming, please. Sleep coming, please. Sleep coming. Do you want to use my body as a gauge for your toxins? Am I your measured toxicity? Where's my mind? Is it stored in some place that's separate from me, flexing like an eye in pain? Stuff your leaflets, stuff your weekly blood tests, stuff your monitoring, stuff your weight gain, stuff your A&E, stuff your seizures, stuff your coma, stuff your impending renal failure. Get me out of here. I'll take a walk home in the rain.
Sounds very refreshing, the walk home in the rain at that point. And is that partly because of the feeling that it might also stifle your creativity in some sense?
Yes. I mean, I think I've just been hugely obstinate about lithium, partly because of that fear of having my creativity stifled, and partly because I've heard such, I won't say horror stories, I don't want to exaggerate, but I've heard some very sad things about the effects on people of taking lithium. I have to say, though, that I've recently joined on Facebook a group called Bipolar Support UK, where I've heard very different stories about lithium. And lithium works very, very well for some people. And I think that there is just a range of, people are all so different. And people respond to medication so differently. But I am medicated. We've found a way of getting around the lithium opposition in me.
Yeah, there may be more that will come out in the question and answer session, perhaps, about lithium. Which I'm happy to chip in to that discussion.
Because do you recommend it, and do you think it's a good thing?
I think it's a very complicated question, that actually, but we can perhaps discuss that. One thing I did want to ask you, that there are a number of portraits of doctors and other healthcare professionals in your book, sort of in the tradition, I suppose, of other great writers like Woolf and Plath who've had this problem. Rather than going into any specific portraits or reflections, I wondered if I might just ask you something that one of my colleagues often asks patients, actually. What would you advise us? What in our suits, you guide us. What could we do differently that would be better? Not just speaking as doctors, but as anyone involved in healthcare.
Well, I don't think I can advise you to do anything better, because you're obviously the ideal psychiatrist.
No. Certainly not.
I'd say that there should be a more concerted effort to collaborate between the humanities and the sciences, and that science needs a more humane face. You used the word client earlier, yes, about the relationship between the psychiatrist and the patient. I don't know, the nomenclature puzzles me.
Yes.
Client is an odd word to come up in this context. Maybe I'm alone in thinking that, but...
Yes, it is a bit confusing. I suppose patient is a very ancient word with very strong, heavy medical connotations. Normally, of someone who is often has to be patient, is sort of under the control in some way, perhaps, of the system, as it were. Whereas I suppose client would suggest more of a degree of agency, and that it's someone who has chosen to use your service and to whom you're accountable in some way, I suppose.
Exactly.
I was
just going to say, Richard, we've hit 6:30.
Yes.
So maybe one more question, then we'll throw it open.
Okay. I'll make this a good, complicated question then. It's about the wider context, I suppose, which inevitably touches on politics and also on things like stigma and so on. I mean, you write quite wonderfully about your experiences of stigma. I love one of your proverbs about stigma. A stigma is like an ill-fitting coat, sooner bin it than let out the seams. The proverbs in the back of the book are absolutely wonderful. I don't know if I can wrap up several questions in a way in one and say, what has been your experience of stigma, of negotiating, having this illness in quite a demanding workplace, but also, I suppose, of deficiencies in the services that might be down to things like lack of funding and...
Yes. Well, as I mentioned, I've joined this bipolar support group, UK group, on Facebook, and it has been a very, very educative experience. These are people who are far, far worse, have a far worse condition than my own. Not only do they have the condition worse, but their circumstances are considerably worse, the material circumstances. So what I experience in reading these posts every day is that sense of being perched slightly on the outside of this very needy community and looking in from a very privileged position, in fact, because all my material circumstances are fine. And so that's uncomfortable. And what I see again and again in these posts is people calling out for help because they're not getting help from the places where you would expect the help to be coming. And this is because this government is depleting the National Health Service to the extent that it is. And these people are not able to turn to the crisis team and get the help they need, because the crisis team isn't funded enough. It's working its butt off trying to deal with all the problems that are coming up, and simply cannot deal with the volume of work that's coming its way. So I think the solution to this is really only going to be a Labour government.
That was a party political broadcast.
Great. Okay, fine. I do apologise about the microphones. Everything was set up this afternoon by the IT manager who, it was all working perfectly, and unfortunately he's not on site to just correct it when it goes wrong, so I do apologise. Thank you for being patient with that. I didn't introduce myself, by the way, and I'm sorry for that. I'm Will Donaldson. I'm college chaplain and one of the co-seniors.